I'm Marci Baker of Alicia's Attic, here to share with you the clear view of quilting. We had a quilter write in asking about how to miter corners on binding for angles that are different than 90 degrees. I have the technique written in my books, Not Your Grandmother's Log Cabin and Oh My Stars. It's important that you cut strips the right width, depending on how thick your batting is, like the Christmas wreath behind me, or if you want to have a different finish, like the quilt behind me, which is a 1-inch finish. This kind of information I have in my series, Know Before You Sew. The example that I'm going to work with today, I have exaggerated the seam allowance so you can see exactly where you need to sew and where you need to fold. And let's look at some examples of what works and what doesn't work. Here's a mitered corner that works. It's done evenly throughout and it keeps the angle of the design. Here, however, is an angle that was not mitered correctly. Too much fabric was put into the corner. And then, because there was such a point, the quilter didn't put enough into the corner and it rounded out. And we lost the angle and it gets very thin right there. So let me show you how we're going to avoid those two things and we're going to get perfect corners. The first thing we need to figure out is where our pivot point is. Here I have shown my seam allowance in from this edge and my seam allowance in from this edge. Where those two lines intersect right there, that is my pivot point. I'll be stitching my binding on along this point, and when I get to that point or just before it, I'm going to pivot and sew off to this corner. That's going to give me a nice miter. So here I've applied my binding, which is double folded. So I have two raw edges running along here, and I stitch along my 1/4 inch seam allowance to the pivot point and then stitch off to the corner. And you can see as I fold this up, by stitching to the corner, that's going to help with this next fold. I have my raw edges in line with the edge of the quilt, and that's very important to have that lined up. And then to fold down, I'm going to fold down in line with this corner where I pivoted out to. And as I line that up, I'm going to fold that there. And so my pivot point is underneath here, but I need to have the fold in line with that corner, not above it, like that. That would give me that pointed corner, and not below it, because that's going to give me the rounded corner. It needs to be right in line with that square, with the corner. And then I'm going to take and I'm going to start stitching right here at the edge and go ahead and stitch down my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to be ready for the next step. So here I start at the very edge and I'm going to stitch down, catching that fold that's in line with the corner, and we're going to stitch down along our seam allowance. Let me show you another angle that we can do and how to fold for that. Here's another angle that's less than 90 degrees, and we need to find our pivot point, which is our seam allowance in from this edge, where it crosses the seam allowance in from this edge, and that is going to give us our pivot point. We'll stitch along the seam, and then at the pivot point, stitch off to the corner. Here we want to make sure that we don't stitch on this side of this corner or along that diagonal, because that will affect the miter. We want to make sure we're on this side, the right side of that diagonal line. Here you can see that I've stitched my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then as I get to the pivot point, I'm going to pivot out to this long skinny angle, and that's going to give us our next miter. Let's go ahead and turn this so you can see the angle. We're going to be getting our raw edges in line here with the edge of our quilt, and we're going to be folding it down. Instead of down low, it's going to be in line with this outer corner, and it's going to look like this. We'll fold it down so we now can't see our quilt like we could on the other one, but this fold needs to be in line with that point, the outer point. And now we're going to take our seam allowance right along there. So here I've stitched down along my seam allowance, and now we need to turn these corners to the back and miter them. So let's look at that. So here we're working with our angle that was larger than 90 degrees, and we're going to pull the fabric around from the front to the back, and I always fold the right side over and then the left side as I look at the point. And we're going to then, where this fabric, as we have it out straight where it crosses the edge of the quilt there. We're going to pull that in and we're going to get a nice miter. I think you can see that. Okay, here's our narrow corner, and we can bring this fabric around from the front to the back, and we do the right side and then the left side. And on the left side we're going to kind of roll this fabric in half and then roll again to get a nice miter here at the corner. But there's still a lot of fabric in here, so let me show you where you can trim to make this even neater. But you need to be careful as you trim to make sure you don't trim too much off. So here's the corner, and the fold was all the way across here to this point. And I trimmed out like a V right here, and then some of this seam right over here to remove some of the bulk. Basically get all this cut back to where it's just the point of the quilt. And then we're going to take and turn this over and pull, as we look at the back, we're going to pull the right side around and line that up. And then we're going to roll that corner edge in part way. And then we'll roll that in again to get our miter. And that has reduced some of the bulk. But you want to be real careful not to cut too close, because then you'll have frayed edges along the front. So that's how we do the miter for the narrower angle. Here I've stitched down the wide angle on the back, including the corners front and back. And that's the back of it. And here's what the front looks like. And then for the narrow angle, this is what the front looks like. And here's the back. When I figured out how to miter the binding for angles different than 90 degrees, it opened up the design possibilities for my projects. I hope this information is helpful. My goal is to make your quilting easier, frustration-free by sharing with you the clear view of quilting. I'm Marci Baker of Alicia's Attic. Thanks for watching.